So Anthony, you've been the director of the Canterbury Museum since 1996. How do you get into a job like that?
Well, a long time ago, when I was a kid, I waltzed up to Auckland Museum and asked if I could have some ferns identified. And the short story is that I started as a volunteer, ended up as the curator of botany, and have been in museums my whole life since. But I got passionate about plants and more passionate, and as botanist at the Auckland Museum, I had the chance to visit lots and lots of offshore islands.
Fantastic, and among those was the Three Kings.
Yeah, an amazing group of islands.
Where are they?
They're 60 k's off the northern tip of Cape Reinga, the North Island, and they're about 15 islands spread out over 15 k's of open ocean.
They're big, or?
The biggest one is Great Island, and that's, I guess, a couple of kilometres long and a kilometre wide. So, big enough when they're tight bush to take a long time to get from one end to the other, but small enough to do over a week.
So you went there botanising, and how did you get across to the island?
Well,
when was this? So when you first went?
When we first went, we were on a fishing boat in 1982, a small fishing boat out of Hohora. We had a storm at sea on the way, and a 6 to 8 hour journey turned into a 14-hour nightmare with lots of seasickness from all concerned. But this is the crew that we went with, and you might even see me there with a head of slightly more hair than I used to have.
So is that you, second from the right at the back row?
That is indeed, yeah, with the Auckland Museum T-shirt on. Yeah,
very good.
It's a long ago memory.
And who's this older fellow on the front right?
On the front right there, that's Professor Jeff Bayliss, who was really my greatest mentor as a botanist. He's often known as the father of Three Kings botany, because he was there in the late 40s, early 50s, really making most of the great discoveries on which our knowledge today is based.
And how did you get involved with him?
Well, he was Professor of Botany at Otago University in the end, and he wrote to me in his early 80s saying that he felt he was about to retire from serious effort and he'd like to hand the mantle on to somebody else. Would I be interested? And I said, would I what? It would be fantastic.
So quite an honour.
Yeah, it was a huge thrill.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So now instead of jumping out of a dinghy, you jump out of a helicopter, is that right?
Yeah, well, I went in 82, 83 and 89 by boats. 2003, my last visit, Doc arranged for a helicopter, which I have to say is a lot easier on the body. It's pretty remarkable to be transported right up to the top of the island, and you see here we just dropped a couple of my colleagues off, and it's a lot easier to climb down and back up again than it is to be put ashore and have to get up the cliffs at the bottom.
Right.
And of course your gear is all landed there right next to your campsite, which is a huge advantage.
So where do you stay when you're on the island?
Well, on Great Island, the big one, there's the only permanent stream, so the campsite is usually adjacent to that stream, so you've got some water for washing. But we stay in tents, or I always stay out in the open in a hammock, because I don't think it's ever rained on me when I've been at the Three Kings. There are, amongst the curious animals there, a very long poisonous millipede, centipede.
Really?
And I don't really want to lie on the ground because they're heat-seeking, and the story is that they come into your sleeping bag or your body. So I followed Prof. Bayliss's advice and bought a hammock, and I've always slept up in a hammock.
So how many Kiwis know that we've got poisonous centipedes?
Well, probably not many. I don't think they'd kill you, but I wasn't willing to even risk it. I mean, they're probably like the Katapo spider, that are... Not nice, but I don't think they're painful, but they wouldn't kill you. Yeah.
So tell us more about the special plants and animals that live on Three Kings.
Okay, well, I think the most spectacular of the plants, and one that we see a lot in cultivation, is puka. Its scientific name is Miritis singperii. This, interestingly, is also found on the Hen and Chickens Islands. Those are the only two places where it's natural. But almost certainly it was shifted from the Three Kings to the Hen and Chickens by prehistoric Maori, because it's such a useful plant with the great big leaves you can imagine as a plate even, or wrapping food and things like that. So we think it was originally only found on the Three Kings, but would have been one of the early translocations of plants by Maori.
Right. So what you're saying is that there is a Polynesian history of three kings as well. So
Yep.
maybe just tell me a little bit about that.
Okay, well, going right back to the very earliest explorers, D'Entrecasteaux and Abel Tasman, in their journals, as they sailed past the Three Kings, they noted signs of Maori habitation, fires, smoke rising. I think there would have been pretty small populations, but the archaeological evidence is pretty clear for permanent occupation at times.
Okay. And there are skinks on the island as well?
Yeah, well, the reason that I find the island so interesting is that they've been separated from the mainland for at least 2 million years, and this has given time for the evolution of a whole range of plants and animals that aren't found anywhere else. And amongst, there's about 17 species of plants that are only found there, but there are also skinks, and here's one of them. It's called Feller's skink, Lilopisma fellei, and you can see two in this one shot. There are times when you walk into the puka forest and this rustle happens and literally hundreds of them scatter. And of course you never see that on the mainland. And that's part of the reason that the kings are so special. There are no predators there. It's a natural system,
right.
And so there's large numbers of animals like the skink.
So do you think the New Zealand mainland would have been like that once, where everywhere you stepped there were lizards and giant insects?
Yep, it'd be a very different place. There'd be bird song all over. I mean, the moas were romping through. The birds that are now completely extinct would have been reasonably common.
Tell me about some of the other plants.
Okay, this one's one of my favourites. We know Tatoki reasonably well on the mainland.
Yes.
There is a endemic species of Tatoki only on the Kings called Electrion grandis. Grandis because it's got really grand, big leaves. But you can see the fruit are very spectacular. And they might remind you of something, but I'll give you a clue. The red part that's wrapped around the dark black seed there, that is the equivalent of a lychee. This is in the same family as lychees. And so that red part is the lychee that attracts the bird to come and eat the fruit. I don't know. They must be to birds because that's how they get around. Another really interesting one around the shoreline on the rocky screes is a hebe, a little shrubby hebe that only occurs on the Three Kings, and its name is Hebe insularis, which means from the island. Yeah, and very spectacular little plant. Really strong mauve-coloured flowers, but of course it's frost tender, growing that far north and down at sea level.
Yes.
We'd have to be very careful down here in Christchurch, I think, of the frost. But it's a
Are they
spectacular little plant.
gardens in the north?
Certainly, yeah. Yeah, it's a great little plant. There's a single fern that only grows there, and this one's called Davallia tasmanii. Because these plants are so rare, they don't really have common names. That's why I'm using the scientific names. The Three Kings fern, yeah. But Davallia tasmanii, and this is an interesting fern in that it's allied to more tropical ferns, and that sort of hints that the Three Kings might be a link to older links into the Pacific, as opposed to some of the southern links that we see through the flora of the South Island.
And is that growing out of a tree? Or?
Yeah, you can see the brown rhizome climbing up the tree. It also grows on the forest floor in great areas sometimes, but it doesn't get fertile. It doesn't produce spores until it goes up a tree.
So it's a climber.
It's a climber.
And so that's a device for spreading spores?
Well, probably to get its spores up where the wind will catch them and blow them around. Yeah.
Interesting.
It is cool. In the 1990s, Bill Sykes, a famous Christchurch botanist,
yes.
Named this plant as a new species. It's one of the kawakawas of New Zealand.
Yep.
Again, only occurs on the Three Kings. Very rare plant there. But you can see it's got very thick, glossy, heart-shaped leaves. Obviously tasty to insects because it's having a nibble there. And very big, gnarly fruit. You can see green fruit.
And does it have the same peppery taste as the kawakawa?
Yeah. It's cool.
Great.
Very showy plant, and I predict that that'll move into cultivation, into gardens a lot more because it's such a showy plant. I said we're still discovering new species there. This one was described only last year by another Christchurch botanist, Colin Burrows.
Yes.
And it's a Pimelia, one of the native Daphnes, little shrub about 30-40 centimetres high. And it leads me to a little story. The Three Kings are obviously named after the Three Kings of the biblical sense,
yes.
Because I think it was Tasman that was sailing past at the time of the Epiphany when the Three Kings found Jesus, the original
Yep.
Three Kings.
Yep.
Three Kings are called Caspar, Melchior and Balthazar. We already have a cabbage tree on the Three Kings called Cordyline caspar, so I convinced Bill Sykes to call the Kawakawa Macropipa Melchior,
yes.
and I tried to get Colin to call this one Pimelia Bafflezar, so we'd have all three kings, but he wouldn't have it.
This could be a public rebuke.
Not at all. No, he was doing the right thing botanically. He's called it Pimelia tellura, but there's more plants to be found.
So I understand were there two species on the island that were down to a single plant?
There were. Yep. The first of them is Ticamanthe speciosa. This is a climber, a vigorous liane. Here it is here with a tendril going out to the right. The big tangle of it in the main stream valley, up in the head of the main stream valley, and it is spreading vegetatively, but interestingly, it's only been seen flowering on the island once, and this photo was taken in 1946.
So it looks healthy, so why isn't it flowering?
Well, we think that in those early days, when the bush was a lot more open and lower, it was getting more light, and so it was causing it to flower. Nowadays, it's growing down in the sub-canopy on a Penantia kaikamako tree.
Yes.
And the canopy of Kanuka is way, way above, and you saw that tendril coming out. Well, it's got nowhere to go. So as part of the conservation effort, some of the dock guys have run strings from down the bottom, twine, right up into the canopy, and we're hoping in time that it'll make it up there, get more sunlight, flower, fruit, and we'll get seedlings happening.
Great. And why were these plants in such a parlous state? What happened to all the others?
Well, in the late 1800s, as a result of shipwrecks, goats were liberated on the island to provide food for castaways. In those days, there wasn't much of a conservation effort. They were more interested in conserving the shipwrecked sailors. So there were little provisions depots there with guns and food, and these goats wild, and apparently Bible tracts in 20 languages, which I don't know what that was going to do for the early Gideons. But that leads into the story of the other remaining rare plant. But before I get there, you can see the understory in this shot is very bare, and that's the goat devastation. The goats had just eaten out everything under this tree.
It's completely stripped, isn't it?
It's stripped out, and so that was, if you like, the second phase of deforestation or devegetation. The early occupation by Maori had seen wholesale clearance, which Tasman and D'Entrecasteaux saw, and the goats between the late 1800s and 1946, when they were eradicated, did a second go, if you like, and open things up.
So whose idea was it to get rid of the goats?
It was Auckland Museum scientists that had gone up there in the 40s, late 30s and early 40s, and seen the devastation, and really got in there and got the Department of Internal Affairs, who used to look after islands in those days, to send hunters up. And the hunters went there for 3 weeks, and I think they shot all the goats, 343 of them, in the first week. And on that first trip was a guy that later became the director of Auckland Museum, Graham Turbot, and he wrote in his notebooks how regeneration happened within that 3 weeks. Once the goats were gone, the next 2 weeks, there were thousands of seedlings coming up in the absence of goats. So it's really a dynamic conservation estate.
Wow. So what you mentioned those two species that were down to the last plant.
Yeah. But this one here is actually in the Guinness Book of Records as the world's rarest tree. It's a really interesting story. A single individual, its name is Penantia baylessiana, so it was named after Prof. Bayliss, who was the discoverer.
So that's related to the kaikamako that we have.
Yeah, it's the only other species we have in this country of kaikamako, so the Three Kings kaikamako. And this is the single tree. Now, it's doubly rare because this is one of those odd New Zealand species that has separate male and female plants, and this one, as we'd have it, is a female. So not only is it the only one, but it is a female only one.
Does that mean that it's doomed? Does it need a male and female plant to fertilise the flowers?
Well, we thought in the early days that perhaps it was doomed because it is a pretty sorry state. And here it is. Just before I go on to that story, here it is in 1982.
It's a beautiful plant.
You can see the huge regeneration down the bottom with goats being removed. There's Prof. Bayliss looking on again.
Yes.
almost 50 years after he discovered it. So it's an amazing sight to be taken there by him. You can see a puka or Maraita with the really big leaves are coming up in amongst the Panantia there. But in terms of its breeding systems, you see these big panicles of flowers. These have turned into young aborted fruits. But in 1989, when we were there, we found a panicle with one ripe fruit. See the purple fruit in there? That was the first ripe fruit seen on the island, and that gave us hope. Well, it gave us the proof that there is some pollen production amongst these mostly female flowers, and that pollen has obviously fertilised just the odd fruit. And so that's allowed breeding projects to happen back on the mainland, where cutting-grown plants are now having the fruit harvested, the fruit grown on to produce seedlings, and we've got a good population of seedling plants growing on the mainland as a risk management for.
So the plant is secure now on the mainland then by growing them from cuttings and so on. Is it appropriate to take them back and plant them over there, or how do you reintroduce plants, or do you?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of revegetation goes on. I think it's a great thing to happen. But in this particular case, these islands are really isolated. They're a wonderful outdoor laboratory for natural regeneration. And scientists believe that this is an example where we should have minimum intervention in the natural process. So we should provide for nature to take care of this, and for these fruit in time to drop or be eaten by birds and spread and come up in a stream somewhere else and naturally regenerate. So that's our hope.
So you're still waiting for this to happen for this tree.
Indeed. But the other danger of taking the pot-grown plants back is that the Three Kings are free of soil pests. There's a huge problem with soil pathogens, fungi. Mm-hmm. There's a native fungus called Phytophthora, which attacks things like the puka, the Maraita, and causes the sudden dieback of plants like that. We're pretty afraid that the introduction of that would wipe out much of the ecosystem there, and it could take these very rare plants with it. So that's another reason for extreme care about any planting back into the islands.
Does that mean you have to be really careful with your shoes and things when you go over there too?
Absolutely. We weren't so careful in the early days, but nowadays it's definitely your clothes are thoroughly sterilised before you go. Pockets, make sure there's no seeds, nothing in trouser cuffs or anything like that. Boots scrubbed and all that kind of stuff. And even your food stores are decontaminated before we go there, so no mouse can get there or anything like that, because they just devastate the islands.
So it's almost like a lab.
Yep, it is. It's really a natural laboratory of what New Zealand might have once been like.
Wow. You mentioned about emptying out your pockets in case there's any seeds. I mean, that brings me to the question of weeds. Is there a weed problem over there, or?
Fortunately, there's not a weed problem. There are about 20 or 30 species of weeds, mostly small, common garden-type weeds that would almost all introduced by humans. So they're concentrated around the helicopter landing place, where the boats mostly land. Where there's been human interference, that's where the weeds are. So that's the reason for being incredibly careful. The introduction of really bad environmental weeds, say pampas grass or agapanthus or something like that, with the cliffs all around these islands, they just go like wildfire, and you'd never be able to eradicate properly. So we watch very carefully. We do weed surveys every time we're there to make sure that we nip things in the bud. And in 2003, we saw the first 2 ever clumps of pampas grass, and they were eradicated instantly.
So how do you think they might have got there?
Well, I think in that case it's probably wind. I think
60 kilometres is not too far.
It's not too far for very light wind-borne seed to come across. I think that's probably what's happened. So that's the reason for going reasonably regularly and monitoring for pests.
Do you have a favourite plant on the Three Kings?
I do. And to find it, we need to go to Little West Island. I think this is probably my favourite island. It's certainly the steepest little island. It's quite a climb once you put ashore here.
How on earth do you get onto that?
Well, right in the foreground there is the point where we landed from dinghies. This is on a very calm day. In 83 when we went there, within 20 minutes of us arriving and landing for a few-hour trip, the seas came up incredibly rough, and there were 60-foot swells. So we were on there for 2 extra nights with not very much food, unfortunately.
Or water.
Or water. We had enough for a day, but as soon as we knew we were stuck, we took care to ration it out. But it's a pretty exciting boys' own adventure to be in a place like that.
Where did you sleep? It looks there's nothing horizontal.
Up on the top, in the Samputakawa forest up the top with little flat patches. Didn't have my hammock, so I did have to sleep on the ground that time, and I was woken up on the second night and had it pointed out to me that one of those centipedes was wrapped around my head on the ground, so I didn't sleep much more for the rest of that night. But nothing untoward happened.
But it's still your favourite island?
Well, it is, and it's got this amazing plant called Ellingamita johnsoni. Now, there is no common name for this because it was thought to only grow on this tiny little island, West Island. It, as you can see, looks a little bit like karaka, superficially like a karaka tree, but its flowers and fruit are very different. And
does it have relations on the mainland?
No, it isn't. It's its own genus. It's related to, there are other plants in the same family in New Zealand, yes, but it is its own genus. It's a really very special plant.
Fantastic.
It's got a fantastic name. This point on the coast of West Island is where the steamship Ellingamite ran aground and sank in 1902, I think it was. And so the plant is named after Ellingamite. Ellingamita is the genus name, and its species name is johnsoni, and that is after Major Johnson, who took Prof. Bayliss up on his yacht Rosemary in the early 1950s. So it's quite a nice history in that name. Yeah, as I said, it's got spectacular flowers, and it's the fruit that really mark it out. Here they are, a big bunch of green fruit, but when they ripen, they go to this fantastic crimson colour, and these presumably would originally have been bird dispersed by pigeons, but there are no pigeons left on the kings anymore, so that's one of the things that's probably inhibiting the spread of these large fruited plants.
So is there any thought to reintroduce pigeons to the island so they can do that dispersal?
In the early 2000s, Doc did introduce, I think it was 6 native pigeons onto the island. We've been unable to confirm absolutely whether they have survived, but we did see a pigeon in 2003, so either it's one of those ones, we couldn't see whether it had a band or not.
Yes.
It's either one of those or one that flew across from the mainland. So the good news is that pigeons are getting there again, which means in time we will, I think, see a shift of these plants in their spread.
And I suppose they were only on those small rock stacks. Do you think they were once on the main island as well?
They could well have been. In 1983, we did find the same plant on the closest of the little rock stacks called the Prince's Islets to West Island. So it's got that far. It's made a jump to the next little island, or perhaps was there all the time. But it's not on the other smaller islands, and it's certainly not on the big island.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It is a cool story.
And I think you said one of your greatest discoveries at Three Kings wasn't, in fact, a plant.
No, it's a bit embarrassing for a botanist, but the last little island I visited in 1983 was this one here. It's called Rosemary Rock, which is named after Major Johnson's yacht.
Yes.
All these little islands are named like Hinamoa, Arbutus, Rosemary. They're all named after the government steamers, boats, yachts that were used for the discovery of the island. So it's quite a nice little bit of history there as well. So this is Rosemary Rock. It's the smallest of the islands. In 83, my landing was the first record of anyone ever landing on this island, and you can see why. It's pretty inhospitable. You can probably just see there a huge host of gulls, screaming gulls in the back, and tens of thousands of red-billed gulls roosting and nesting on the island. So it's quite exciting climbing up. But when I got up to the top, I heard a strange croaking noise that wasn't the gulls screeching, and there are 6 of these amazing large birds, very large birds, 5 of them sitting on earthen nests. You can see the nest there with eggs in the nests. And not being a bird person, I had to take photographs and write incredibly careful notes and drawings and estimate measurements and things like that. And when I got back to the mainland, I found out that these are Buller's mollymawks or Buller's albatrosses. which had never been found breeding anywhere near the Three Kings before.
So where's the nearest breeding ground for those?
Well, they naturally occur in the Chatham Islands, the Snares and the Antipodes, so the Chathams and the Subantarctic Islands. So this breeding colony is between 1,300 and 1,600 kilometres north of where they've ever been.
So a real surprise.
Before. So it was an amazing thrill. Yeah, it was cool.
So just to wrap it up, I mean, how important are islands like the Three Kings for conservation in New Zealand?
Well, I think they're critically important. We're lucky that they are so isolated because that helps protect them in a way. But they would be, for me, amongst the greatest nature reserves in this country because they provide this amazing snapshot, not just on plants and animals that only grow there, but a window into systems and the way nature was, perhaps as close as you can get pre-human interference. So they're like a little, as you said before, a laboratory on which you can see natural processes and get a glimpse back into the past of where our country's come from.
Great. Thank you very much.
So, thank you.